Welcome back, everybody. We're up to our second last presentation for this stream, and we've got Danny Pentongill from Loddon Plains Landcare Network. Danny is the current recipient of the Victorian Government Our Communities Leadership Development in Innovation 2019 grant. The grant focuses on understanding how improving the biodiversity on farm can support the relationships between groundwater hydrology, soil health, carbon capture, and healthy flora and fauna populations, and inevitably enhance sustainable farming practices. Danny is also the board director of Landcare Victoria Incorporated, and is on a mission to demonstrate how the incorporation of land management practices that promote biodiversity on and off farm can have direct flow and benefits for the landowner. Something definitely worth hearing about. All right, Danny, over to you.
Wonderful, thanks, Luke. So I'd just like to start by personally acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the country and the land on which we meet today. Of course, that's different for all of us. I acknowledge the rich living cultures and traditions and the connections of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and their intrinsic connection to the land that we live and work on. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the lands on which you're all on today and acknowledge the people and the culture of that place. So I'd just like to start here with, maybe proposing a few questions. So how do we look at a landscape, and how do we think about management in a system-based or long-term stewardship approach? And with that in mind, what does it mean to assess or manage for landscape health on a catchment and a micro catchment level, which can change, across the country or across a region, but can also change on farm. And by understanding the requirements of a landscape through observation and basic or developed monitoring practices, we're able to provide decision-making tools to create systems that are more resilient and productive for farming and for biodiversity, and ultimately more productive for landscapes and for enterprise. So for a bit of context, this came about by, as Luke mentioned, the Victorian Government's Our Catchment, Our Communities Leadership Development Program. About 2.5 years ago, I was funded to undertake a program called Reading Landscapes. And the key aim of that was to provide an entry-level journey towards understanding landscapes for farmers and for land managers, and beginning that kind of adoption practice for sustainable or regenerative, or what I tend to call alternative or kind of progressive farming management systems. So the key aim for this was to be able to allow farmers to understand their landscapes and understand what they have, and put that into their decision-making practices when it came to maintaining cover, managing for biodiversity, looking at their stock management, but also looking at other industries such as carbon or perhaps native food industries, and how that can tie into their enterprise. So to start to understand, a real key aim of this was to be able to make it accessible for people and make it really easy. I wanted people to be able to go out and tinker around in the shed and make a few things, or go to the op shop and grab a few, collect a few things on local hardware. What this relied on was some penetrometer readings, which this one's a bit swanky, but they're quite easy to kind of put together with a bit of scrap metal and a bit of and a welder if you've got one. We also looked at vegetation and cover scores, the abundance of small invertebrates and insects and native pollinators, and the abundance of birds, but also took into account the plant community in a landscape or in a farming system through observations, and drone imagery or landscape imagery was also important to this. So what did this provide? The hotel data gave us an indication of native pollinators. Traps were employed to provide an indication of small vertebrate abundance, and nesting and occupancy behaviour was observed across the year. So this became really important across the year, where we saw in the kind of breeding and mating season of native pollinators, or that active period. Of course, we were seeing a lot of native bees and a lot of native wasps, but through the year, These were essentially simulating kind of remnant habitat or large trees. And so we were finding reptiles were overwintering in them. We were finding a lot of spiders and a lot of other insects using them as well. Drone data provided a bit of a snapshot of vegetation across the seasons through orthomosaic imagery and also through photo point data. And that is able to provide an indication of land use, water movement, so surface water, of course, ground cover and stock movement and stock management. So what this was able to do was allow appropriate land management stewardship approaches to be designed for improved outcomes for biodiversity and for enterprise. And down the bottom there, we've got we also employed a golf ball monitoring score that Nick Schultz and his team developed and Parks Victoria used for their grassland scoring. And that provided a consistent scoring system to evaluate vegetation cover paired with penetrometer data that gave us compaction data, but it also gave us the potential of moisture absorption or moisture retention in your soils. So John Anderson, provided that great bit of information of 1 unit of carbon equaled, about 6 units of moisture capacity or potential moisture capacity. And that's kind of what we were doing there, trying to index that. What became really important throughout the trial was looking at each side of the fence. And this was really important because it's the same landscape, but a fence provides a physical barrier. And often that physical barrier means that there are different techniques and different management priorities that are undertaken just because of this physical barrier. So it gave a really good snapshot looking at a comparison from one side of the fence to the other, and can provide some really good information to advance those stewardship techniques that we were looking at or that we want to try and promote in adoption practices. So once we've got all of this data, we can do it all. I know I've got some fancy graphs there, but the main thing that we were looking at was trying to look at the resilience of a landscape and how we can start to improve that. And so down the bottom, of the 5 trial sites that were part of this project, they were all farms, they were all operating. We've got from left to right, probably the more resilient right through to perhaps the less resilient of the landscapes. And what was pretty overwhelming here was the practices that involved more, I suppose, alternative farming methods and perenniality in their systems were more healthy across this window. So on the left-hand side, that was largely a kind of farming system that took in rotational grazing practices, took in perenniality, but also did a significant amount of design in their revegetation and their landscape and biodiversity assets. And what we were seeing was a much higher landscape health index across the board in that site. If we go to the middle provides a really great indication of this kind of both sides of the fence. So what we've got there is 3 different management techniques all in one photo. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, but just in here. And so at the top right of the screen in that photo, we've got a predominantly set stock or long-term stocking paddock. We can start to see, or evidently, there's more bare patches. It was highly compacted. The vegetation cover was impacted, but also the vegetation height and the penetrometer scores were impacted as well. On the top left of that same photo, we've got an area that the land manager had put aside as a biodiversity asset or a conservation asset and put a fence around it. And so the management changes, just from the other side of the fence. And what we found there was a greater concentration of bird abundance, a greater concentration of insect abundance, and a few reptiles, but also the potential to hold moisture and the capacity for moisture, skyrocketed in that sense as well. The management technique there, I think that's grazed perhaps twice a year just to keep exotics down, but we also saw that there were significantly more native species in that area as well, such as forbs and herbs and the like. Down the bottom of that photo where you can see the dam there, kind of sat in the middle. So again, fenced, that's a saltbush paddock with a bit more perenniality in its grasses and in its native pastures. And what we found there was it was holding a lot more, again, a lot more insects, probably more than up in that top left conservation area, and a huge amount more of more reptiles, and that kind of coincided with a greater potential for moisture and a greater or kind of less compaction and a greater overall cover score. So if we move right across to the right hand side, I want to be clear here that this particular landscape and this particular management system was put in for a reason, or implemented for a reason, and that reason was to try and combat salinity through forestry. And it was very effective doing that. But what was really interesting here was because of the monoculture of tree planting in the middle of that photo, we don't get an understory, and what resulted from that was significantly harder ground, so more less resilient or less ability to capture moisture, and probably more surface moisture going off into the surrounding landscape. What was also really interesting was the invertebrate count, particularly around native pollinators and bees and so forth, was very high, and we can see that in overall numbers of abundance. But that was only for a certain period of the year. Because there was a high nectar and a high pollen load, we were seeing in that period there was significantly higher insect numbers, but across the year it doesn't necessarily translate that way. So that's just I suppose a good tale to kind of put forward for seasonal monitoring as well, and understanding that landscapes can play some key roles in key times of the year. So what does this all mean when we're starting to plan for biodiversity? The use of shelter belts or arcs, like as David Lindenmayer spoke about this morning with block planting, can be a really good basis for natural improvements, particularly in larger areas. And well-designed areas such as this can be accessed from all sides, for instance, can provide really great benefit for what I tend to call, or start to call, the invisible surplus. So that's around stock and protection of stock, but it's also things like breaking up wind and becoming really great wind barriers to protect your soil moisture and protect evaporation, wind evaporation, those sorts of things, protect soils and the like. It provides great habitat opportunity and greater species abundance, and therefore providing greater biodiversity value to the farm. It slows water, which then impacts into your kind of more productive areas of the farm by allowing that moisture potential to get to its fullest. So by slowing the water, you allow the water to get into those areas and be able to permeate through. So including a root profile and including shrubs, ground covers and the like is really important in that as well. Again, in that last slide, with so many, if you've got so many trees in a landscape, you're not actually allowing that ground to open up a little bit more, or the roots of those ground covers, those shrubs and the like, and the grasses that you want in a landscape, to open up that soil profile in order to maximise that benefit. And what we're seeing, and I know Rowan's either following me or he's on this afternoon, is exploring opportunities in things like timber production, which Rowan will speak about, but also in things like native foods, particularly as artisan markets are growing. These kind of areas can actually start to provide a bit more yield and work into the enterprise. And I think that's a really untapped market that we can start to look at. So all of this is great, but how do we promote the adoption of this? And this has again come out of this kind of Reading Landscapes program. And what we've got here is a framework that provides some, I suppose, some choices and some guidance around assessing the landscape and recognising the intentions or the requirements of that landscape and the landscape function. Right through to implementing that and designing and delivering. And the really important one I want to touch on here is monitoring. So building in continual monitoring, again, David spoke about that this morning. in order to understand what's working, being able to provide that decision-making framework to adapt to what's not working, and also to continue to design well, or build well-designed landscapes can be really crucial. Also, getting a year or so of data behind something like this is proving that that can be really effective. By just understanding what's happening in the landscape, it can just give you some really great decision-making tools when you're starting to do something like this. I did another webinar for Landcare Australia earlier in the year where I delved into this a little bit more, so I'll keep going, but I encourage anyone who's interested to go and have a look at that, if they would like to. And this is all, so from that framework and from these monitoring and adoption practices, what's come out of that is what I've called the Plains Plant Selection Matrix. And this is the resource that that kind of puts all of these ideas and all of these concepts into practice. And what it allows us is support for the framework that brings about 300 species of Central Victoria together, plus a suite of common species for agriculture production or enterprise, such as fodder, forestry, and the like. It also provides 20 different attributes that land managers and land stewards can start to design to, depending on what they have and what they require in their landscape. So that might look at pioneer species, it might look at salinity or erosion issues, it might look at providing shelter for stock or food or fodder and those kinds of things. So this really just gives a structure to all of that in which you can kind of sit down and design your landscape for the function that you require, but also for what it needs to do on a biodiversity, in a biodiversity sense. And this is a bit of the rubber meets the road. So what we've done here is we've been able to take that framework, we've been able to take all of that into a farm in Central Victoria, and now we're starting to draft up a bit of a plan and a bit of a design for enhanced biodiversity, greater production for stock and for food stock food systems, but also looking at the landscape function and designing for things like erosion management, surface water, and also vegetation cover or the lack thereof. So this is a really exciting kind of area where we can kind of take something and start to move it forward and progress it. So just finishing up with some key takeaways, we need to really acknowledge that landscapes vary and understand how a landscape's functioning on a catchment or a micro catchment scale, but also how it needs to function in a farm system and what it needs to achieve for the enterprise. It's really important to know what you're managing and be able to set goals to achieve those good landscape outcomes for function and for resilience. So being able to sit down and assess that and understand what you're working to is really important when you're doing these sorts of things. And decision-making tools provide really vital frameworks to allow adaptive management systems, particularly moving into long-term resilience and resilient landscape systems. Perennials are great, we know that. There's so much work on that now, but a well-profiled root system in some of these conservation or biodiversity areas is just as important. And providing year-round food sources is also really important for that food chain of those species that you want in the environment and in your landscape. Just to finish off, the link between soil management and the opportunity for biodiversity is really vital. It's the foundation to functioning ecosystems. So healthy soils provide that, and by doing that and by looking at that and assessing that in our goals, we can provide for greater biodiversity, for better landscape function, moisture retention, and more resilient landscapes overall and resilient landscape systems. So that's the formalities, Luke. I'm happy to hand that over to any questions now. And I'd just like to finish off by thanking, I've got a little bit of time, so I'd really like to thank the technicians being in that game for an awfully long time. You're doing a wonderful job, and I really commend you on that. And I really want to thank the participants and the volunteers. Without the volunteers and the participants in these things, we can't do what we do, and we can't share this sort of knowledge. So thanks very much. And I want to congratulate everybody from Landcare Australia on the event and getting it up and running. It's been a really mighty effort.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Danny. Mate, it's a team effort across the board, and what a conference it's been. It's been such a good conference. And thanks so much for your presentation, the sharing of your knowledge. I find it fascinating with the array of land management techniques out there and the evolving knowledge on it. I mean, biodiversity, biodiversity, biodiversity is the key takeaway across the board for everything from soil to productivity to everything. Mate, you've triggered a fair few questions here, so rather than me rabbiting on, I'll get straight onto those. The first one there is from Mike Moller. What is the basis of the golf ball monitoring?
Great question. So I pilfered that from Nick Schultz and his team at I think they're at Federation University. So the basis for that for us is it provides an index score, and Parks Victoria have got a really great resource on this as well. They use it for monitoring their grasslands, but for us, it was a slightly different adoption practice, and it became a really easy tool to give a kind of pasture score or a cover score that took in vegetation height as well. So by using the 18 golf balls in a 1 by 1 metre quadrat, you then count on either a full point, a half point, or a 0 point. And that gives you a score out of 18. And obviously the more score you have, the less ground cover you have, the less score you have, the greater the ground cover and the higher that is, because you can't actually see the golf balls. So it seemed as though, particularly over this program, somewhere around that kind of 8 to 12 seemed quite good. It held some really good, it held moisture capacity. It also held some really good kind of biodiversity assets and those sorts of things, and provided some really good ground cover.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I'll move straight to the next question. Julie McKay asks, is there a benefit from a block biodiversity site to adjacent landscape that is farmed? I think Julie is referring to the slide where you showed up the photo with the different management techniques across the board. You had that biodiversity planning and then straight farming next to it.
Yeah. Look, I think so. Any of that has to help, and I think the key point of that is when we're designing these things, as David said in his presentation, you know, the kind of ribbon planting model of these kind of assets, landscape assets, is probably the most convenient, but the block planting nature gives a much greater opportunity to protect from those kind of elemental things, such as, you know, wind and weather, but also holding and slowing flow. So anything adjacent to a farming practice, it can be really important to be able to do that. If you can slow the water at a kind of biodiversity asset or a landscape asset that then starts to filter through to a productive area of the farm, then that just provides greater moisture capacity or potential for you to be able to hold the moisture on the property. And then that goes with things like ground cover and that root profile. So there's a whole lot of work being done in that space. And I know Sustainable Farms at ANU have done a power of work there as well. So I would direct anybody interested in that, I'd direct them to those resources.
Yeah, great, Danny. Actually, it's a good segue to Helen asks, is there any opportunity to actually get the slides, mate? Is there?
Absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, happy to do that. I'll, don't know.
We've got Helen here, so we can probably liaise with you and Helen, and we can sort of sort that out.
Yeah.
We can assess with the rest of the participants.
Yeah. I might even, if I get some time, I might even pop that in the lobby chat as well as a link.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll find it very useful. All right, guys, we've run out of time. We're going to have a short break now and move on to the next presentation. This is the final presentation for today by, as Danny says, by Rowan. So thanks again, Danny. Very informative presentation, and I'll hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Luke. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, mate.